Return of the Jedi. The throne room of the second Death Star. Luke Skywalker is on his knees while force lightning tears through his body. Blue-white arcs of electricity that have been burning through him for seconds. And Darth Vader is standing at the edge of the platform, doing nothing. 23 years of total obedience to the man doing this. 23 years inside the suit, inside the Empire, inside the silence. Then, Vader moves. He crosses the platform, lifts the Emperor over his head, a man who hasn't been physically constrained by anyone in decades, and carries him to the reactor shaft. The lightning keeps coming the entire time, arcing through Vader's own armor because it has nowhere else to go, passing through his chest panel, through the mechanical systems that are the difference between Anakin Skywalker and the Void. He throws Palpatine into the shaft. Vader is dying before Palpatine hits the bottom. The lightning that passed through his suit in those seconds had damaged the life support machinery keeping him breathing. His respirator, his chest panel, the entire mechanical apparatus holding him to life, conducting electricity straight into his body. He makes it long enough to remove his helmet, long enough to see Luke's face with his own eyes, for the first time in more than 2 decades. Then his lungs give out. Every relationship Palpatine ever had was an engineered trap. The trap for Vader was architectural, a suit of armor constructed, at minimum in Legends and structurally in both continuities, to make rebellion not just dangerous, but mechanically fatal. The one act that could end Palpatine's rule was the same act that would kill the only man capable of performing it. That's not coincidence. That's a system. Palpatine didn't merely manipulate people. He built dependencies that collapsed inward on the people inside them. He manufactured crises on both sides of wars he was publicly fighting. He groomed an apprentice over a decade, then locked that apprentice in armor designed to prevent him from ever turning the tables. He turned the Sith rule of 2, a doctrine of genuine succession, master surpassed by student, into a stage production where every apprentice was a controlled asset being auditioned for the moment they'd become useful enough to sacrifice. Too evil even for the Sith. Exhibit by exhibit, here's the proof. The suit demands its own testimony, because the suit is the most concrete expression of Palpatine's methodology made physical. After Mustafar, Anakin Skywalker had third-degree burns across the majority of his body. He'd lost both legs at the thigh, his left arm at the elbow, and his right arm had already been amputated 3 years earlier on Geonosis. His lungs were scorched beyond repair. He needed total life support within hours. Palpatine had the apparatus ready, and the Empire building that apparatus was the same Empire simultaneously engineering the first Death Star, a weapon capable of vaporizing a planet. Precision wasn't beyond their capabilities. What Vader received wasn't precise. Documented in Legends sources, including the Dark Lord, the Rise of Darth Vader novel, the suit was substandard in ways that weren't accidental. Crude internal systems, needles for injections rather than more refined delivery mechanisms, controls requiring physical interaction with damaged nerve endings. The hardware was built to function and to hurt. The design logic ran along 2 parallel tracks. The first was practical. Pain deepened a dark side practitioner's connection to the Force, and Vader in constant agony was Vader at peak dark side capacity, which made him a more effective instrument. The second was strategic. A Vader in perpetual physical suffering was a Vader too preoccupied to think clearly about the terms of his arrangement. The suit didn't just keep him alive, it kept him occupied with the cost of staying alive. Then there's the lightning problem, which is the more precise mechanism of control. Force lightning is electricity. It conducts through metal. The suit Palpatine built for Vader ran entirely on electrical systems. The respirator, the cybernetic limb controllers, the cardiac support, the full infrastructure between Anakin Skywalker and death. In Legends, this vulnerability to electrical charge was built in rather than incidental. The suit was susceptible to force lightning in ways that standard Imperial armor wasn't. Canon sources are less explicit about whether the vulnerability was deliberately engineered or simply inherent to the design. But in both continuities, the structural result is identical. Vader can't safely generate force lightning because his hands are entirely mechanical prosthetics, and his master can end him at any moment by raising 2 fingers. That asymmetry was the cage's interior architecture. Palpatine carried a kill switch in his own hands at all times, and every time force lightning crackled in a briefing chamber or aboard a Star Destroyer, Vader was standing within range of it. One additional constraint was baked into the system. Force lightning doesn't only kill. In a dark side practitioner, it amplifies. A force sensitive who can channel and direct lightning is operating at a qualitatively different level of dark side power. Vader, sealed in a metal shell, couldn't access that amplification. He couldn't generate it, couldn't channel it, couldn't even let it wash over him without his life support taking damage. Legend sources characterize a healthy Anakin Skywalker, uninjured, unencumbered, as potentially the most powerful Force user who had ever lived. The Vader Palpatine kept around was a fraction of what Anakin could have been, and the gap between those two numbers was the suit's most important specification. So, a suit causing constant pain. A suit conducting electricity to its occupants' vital systems. A suit preventing its wearer from generating or channeling force lightning. A suit capping the force potential of the most powerful force sensitive in the galaxy. Palpatine put Darth Vader inside it and called him his right hand. In that throne room aboard the second Death Star, Vader absorbs sustained force lightning through that suit. It passes through his armor, through his chest panel, through every mechanical system keeping him alive. He makes it to the hangar, makes it to Luke's ship, makes it long enough to die in his son's arms. The cage worked exactly as designed, and failed anyway. We'll return to why. Before the suit, before Vader, before the Senate, before the Clone Wars, there was a man named Darth Plagueis, and he was Palpatine's master, and he taught Palpatine everything. Plagueis' obsession, referenced in legends and canonically acknowledged when Palpatine tells Anakin about him at the Coruscant Opera House in Revenge of the Sith, was cheating death, specifically manipulating midi-chlorians to prevent it. He could, Palpatine would later tell Anakin, use the Force to influence the midi-chlorians to create life. He made this the organizing project of his existence. He was the foremost practitioner of an art that promised ultimate control over the one force that controls everyone. Palpatine killed him in his sleep. The Legends timeline, established in James Luceno's Darth Plagueis novel, places the murder on or near the night of Palpatine's election as Supreme Chancellor. The apprenticeship ended not because the teaching was complete, or because Plagueis had failed in some way. It ended because the balance of dependency had shifted. Plagueis needed Palpatine's political maneuvering to continue building Sith power through the Senate. Palpatine no longer needed Plagueis' teachings because he had absorbed them. The moment those two calculi reversed, Plagueis died. The ultimate irony of his life's work. He could manipulate the Force to preserve life, but couldn't save himself from the apprentice he had spent decades cultivating. A man who devoted everything to mastering death was killed in his sleep by the student he trusted most, precisely because that trust was total. What matters for the playbook isn't the murder itself, it's the timing. Palpatine wasn't reacting to a window of opportunity when he killed Plagueis. He was executing the final step of a plan that had been running in parallel with the entire apprenticeship. He learned everything Plagueis had to teach. He cultivated independent public power through the Senate. He waited. Then he acted. Plagueis wasn't the first casualty of the playbook. He was the proof of concept, the confirmation that the method worked even on the man who had trained its architect. Between Plagueis' death and the Clone Wars, Palpatine needed to close a gap. Senator of Naboo to Supreme Chancellor of the Republic. He needed a crisis large enough to make a no-confidence vote feel necessary and a succession feel inevitable. Darth Sidious instructed Trade Federation Viceroy Newt Gunray to blockade Naboo, his own home planet. The Ultimate Star Wars sourcebook confirms the mechanism directly. The assurances of his shadowy Sith benefactor, Darth Sidious, prompted Gunray to take the drastic step of blockading the planet of Naboo. The crisis created a political emergency. The emergency enabled Queen Amidala to call for a vote of no confidence in Chancellor Valorum. Valorum fell. Palpatine, the respected senior senator from a planet in the middle of an active crisis, was elected Supreme Chancellor by a grateful Senate. He was running the blockade and the election campaign simultaneously. One man, two operations, one outcome. This wasn't the masterwork. It was the prototype, a small-stakes test of a method that would later be scaled to an entire galaxy. One planet, one crisis, one election. The lesson confirmed was simple. Manufacture the emergency. Position yourself as the solution. Collect the power that flows to the person who resolves what they created. In 10 years, he ran the same play across 1,000 star systems on both sides of the same war. 22 years before the Battle of Yavin, the Clone Wars began at Geonosis. The Galactic Republic and the Separatist Confederacy went to war across a galaxy of 10,000 inhabited systems, with billions of sentient beings caught in the crossfire of what looked, from any angle, like a genuine ideological conflict. A centralized republic defending its institutions against a secessionist movement with legitimate grievances. Supreme Chancellor Palpatine led the Republic's war effort from Coruscant. He attended emergency Senate sessions. He projected gravity and reluctance, a leader presiding over a conflict he hadn't sought and was doing everything in his power to end. He approved military budgets, reviewed casualty reports, and expressed measured optimism about the prospect of peace. Darth Sidious, from the same office on the same planet, was directing the Separatists through Count Dooku. The same man was fighting both sides, not metaphorically, operationally. The Galactic Senate had granted emergency powers to Supreme Chancellor Palpatine during the Separatist crisis, granting him authority to acquire the clone army from Kamino and launch the first military strike on the Separatist foundries at Geonosis. The emergency that justified those powers was the crisis Sidious had spent years engineering through Dooku and the Separatist movement. The Senate handed Palpatine the tools to fight a war he was already running from both sides. Inside the clone army, the final mechanism was already in place before the first battle. Clone troopers had behavioral modification chips embedded in their brains during gestation on Kamino, presented to the Jedi, who were now commanding this army, as safeguards against rogue behavior. The actual function was different. Once activated, these chips would override the clones' independent judgment completely, forcing them to execute Order 66. Kill all Jedi, immediately, without hesitation. The chips were installed during the army's creation, years before any Jedi knew Order 66 existed. For 3 years, the Jedi led and named and trusted and mourned these soldiers. When Clone Trooper 5s finally found a modified chip in the brain of his brother Tup, the war was weeks from its end. The Jedi spent 3 years commanding their own execution squad. The war itself served a function beyond its battlefield operations: time, specifically the time required to transfer power incrementally through the Senate's own emergency protocols. The longer it ran, the more executive authority concentrated in the Chancellor's office. Each delegation of power seeming reasonable in context, each expansion of authority following directly from the last. By the time Order 66 executed and Palpatine stood before the Senate to declare the Galactic Empire, the Republic had already governed itself out of existence. The Senate cheered. They had handed it to him emergency measure by emergency measure, while fighting a war on both sides of which he was standing. One specific detail makes the blueprint fully visible. The Senate's emergency powers vote in Attack of the Clones was formally moved by Jar Jar Binks, the Gungan representative who had helped bring Padme Amidala's plea for help to Coruscant during the Naboo crisis a decade earlier. The man whose intervention saved Palpatine's home planet was now, in a moment of genuine good faith, delivering Palpatine the means to end the Republic. Palpatine didn't arrange that specifically. He didn't need to. The architecture he'd built made it structurally inevitable that someone with good intentions would do it. A leader who manufactures crises. who publicly rallies people against threats he's privately arranging, who consolidates powers at every opportunity, always urgently, always in the name of safety, always with the full democratic participation of the institutions he's dismantling. That pattern isn't unique to a galaxy far, far away, and the audience already knows it. Count Dooku wasn't a fool. He was a Jedi Master, one of the most gifted of his generation, a student of Yoda, a practitioner of Makashi, whose precision with a blade was almost unmatched in the Order. He left because he could see the Republic's corruption clearly enough that remaining felt like complicity. The Senate's greed was real. The institutional rot was documented. His disillusionment was earned. That's exactly what made him usable. Dooku became Darth Tyrannus, built the Separatist Confederacy into a power capable of challenging the entire Republic, and served as the public face of a movement that millions of beings found genuinely compelling. His arguments against the Senate weren't fabricated. They were accurate, and anyone who had spent years inside the Jedi Order watching the Republic's decline could see that. He gave the Separatist cause moral legitimacy it would never have had with a corporate figurehead at its center. What the canonical record establishes is that Dooku served Sidious's agenda with full operational knowledge, coordinating Separatist military strategy, directing General Grievous, managing the war from inside the Confederacy's leadership. He was aware enough of the broader plan to understand Order 66's existence and mechanism. He knew the war was a controlled event. What he didn't know was that his entire function was as the war's most expensive prop. Dooku's job, in Palpatine's architecture, was to make the conflict credible. A separatist movement led by a former Jedi Master, a man of documented integrity with genuine grievances, was a movement the Republic had to take seriously. That moral weight was what made emergency powers votes feel necessary, what made the war feel like a genuine ideological conflict rather than a corporate dispute. Without Dooku, the Separatists were the Trade Federation in a different hat. With him, they had the gravity to justify a decade of galactic war and the suspension of centuries of Republican governance. He was also functioning as a recruitment filter. As Darth Tyrannus, Dooku identified, trained, and deployed Force-sensitive warriors, including Asajj Ventress and Savage Opress, creating a pipeline of dark side practitioners Palpatine could evaluate from a distance and discard without any of it touching his own hands. Then, Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi boarded the Invisible Hand. The Chancellor was rescued. Palpatine's instruction was simple and direct: kill Dooku. The man kneeling on the floor of that observation deck, handcuffed, the war entering its final weeks: kill him. Dooku had served his purpose. A more valuable piece had arrived, and Palpatine was already past the moment where Dooku's continued existence was worth its administrative cost. Matthew Stover's Revenge of the Sith novelization records what moved through Dooku's mind in those final seconds. As he looked up into Anakin Skywalker's eyes for the last time, Count Dooku knew that he had been deceived, not just that day, but for many, many years. A man who had left the Jedi Order because he could see how power corrupts institutions spent a decade and a half as the instrument of the most thoroughly corrupt act in galactic history. He didn't get a speech. Palpatine said, "Do it." Anakin did it. Dooku thought he was the inside player. He was the most controlled piece on the board, a former Jedi Master who believed his ideological clarity made him perceptive enough to navigate a Sith Master's court, and who never once noticed that his master had already chosen his replacement years before the war began. The most revealing exhibit in Palpatine's playbook isn't the one that worked perfectly. It's the one that broke, and what Palpatine had to do to repair it. Darth Maul was Palpatine's first trained operative, conditioned from childhood on Dathomir, deployed as an assassin, sent to Naboo to retrieve Queen Amidala and neutralize the Jedi interference. He was never a Sith apprentice in the philosophical sense the rule of two implies. He was a weapon with a title. When Obi-Wan Kenobi caught him above the reactor shaft at Theed and bisected him at the waist, Palpatine had a replacement within months in the form of Count Dooku. What Palpatine didn't account for was that Maul didn't die. The canonical mechanism, Maul sustained himself through pure dark side hatred. Two pieces of a bisected body, falling into the reactor shaft below the Theed generator complex, held together by sheer rage and kept from full death by the dark side's sustaining energy. He landed in a garbage transport. That transport eventually carried him to the junk planet Lotho Minor, where he spent more than a decade, in a deteriorating mental state, surviving on vermin, having constructed crude spider-like legs from scavenged machinery, existing at the boundary of sanity. When his brother Savage Opress tracked him down and brought him back to Dathomir, their mother Talzin had to use Night Sister magic to restore his shattered mind. What came back was something Palpatine had never built and never intended to exist. A Sith-trained force wielder with no master, no obligation, no institutional loyalty, a decade of compounded grievance, and nothing to lose. Maul moved with a speed and strategic sophistication that suggested the years of madness had clarified something rather than simply degraded it. He didn't attempt to reinstall himself in a Sith hierarchy or seek Palpatine's acknowledgement. He built independent power from the outside in. Death Watch was a Mandalorian splinter faction, hungry to reclaim their planet. Maul promised them Mandalore in exchange for their soldiers. The Pike Syndicate controlled the spice trade through the Coruscant underworld routes. Maul offered protection. Black Sun ran extortion networks across dozens of systems. Maul gave them a military arm. The Hutt clan owned the Outer Rim's criminal economy. One by one, he assembled them. Death Watch, the Pikes, Black Sun, the Hutts, into the Shadow Collective, a criminal empire with genuine military capacity, a standing army, and political footholds across multiple systems. Then he took Mandalore, one of the most strategically significant planets in the galaxy, with a warrior culture whose military traditions predated the Republic itself, fell to a Sith cast-off operating entirely outside Palpatine's organizational chart. Maul had a throne. He had an army. He had the beginnings of what could become a third power center in a galaxy that was supposed to be perfectly divided between exactly two. Palpatine traveled to Mandalore personally. That single detail is the crack in the methodology. He didn't send Dooku, didn't dispatch Grievous, didn't commission a bounty hunter. The man who managed the Clone Wars through proxies, who had spent decades never directly touching his own operations, who had maintained the fiction of Sheev Palpatine, the benevolent Chancellor, while Darth Sidious did the actual work, flew himself to Mandalore in Clone Wars Season 5 to address the problem of someone he'd discarded a decade earlier. He fought Maul and Savage Opress simultaneously. He was operating in a body that presented publicly as a mild-mannered, aging politician, and he fought two Sith-trained warriors at once and won without apparent difficulty. He killed Savage first, right in front of Maul, watching Maul watch his brother die, and then defeated Maul in direct combat. His statement to Maul afterward, "There is only one reality of the Sith. There can only be two, and you have been replaced." His explanation for why he'd come personally. "You have become a rival." Then he kept Maul alive. Why? The canonical record doesn't supply a single clean answer, which is part of why this specific moment generates more sustained debate than almost anything else in Clone Wars lore. One functional reading. A dead Maul had no operational value, while a broken and controllable Maul could still be aimed at problems. A second. Killing him immediately after a witnessed fight on Mandalore created political complications Palpatine didn't need during the war's accelerating final phase. A third, observed in outcome rather than stated as motive. Maul's siege of Mandalore in the final days of the Clone Wars drew Ahsoka Tano and a full corps of clone troopers away from the broader conflict, pulling Jedi-adjacent resources out of position precisely when Order 66 needed the galaxy's Jedi population isolated and separated. Palpatine didn't engineer Maul's siege. He'd repurposed the malfunction. But Maul was never fully rebroken. He escaped Order 66. He survived. He spent years on Dathomir, wandered the Outer Rim, eventually ended up on Tatooine, a desert planet with one old Jedi living in the sand, and the specific person responsible for the ruin of Maul's life, living 20 kilometers away in a farmhouse. Star Wars Rebels, Season 3, Episode 20, Twin Sons. Obi-Wan Kenobi was waiting. The duel between them, when it finally came, lasted about 4 seconds of actual combat. 3 exchanges of movement, then it was over. Kenobi killed him. Maul died asking whether the child on Tatooine was the one who would destroy the Sith. Kenobi told him yes. Maul's last words were that he hoped the boy would avenge them both. Palpatine's most thoroughly discarded tool spent his final breath hoping someone else could finish what the playbook had made impossible for Maul himself to finish. The cage didn't break him completely. The system didn't model him correctly. And in the gap between what was planned and what Maul actually became, there was a demonstrated fact. The playbook's confidence in its own completeness was its most exploitable assumption. Every exhibit so far, Plagueis, Naboo, the Clone Wars, Dooku, Maul, operated on timescales of months to years. The Naboo crisis ran across weeks. The Clone Wars lasted 3 years. Even the Plagueis apprenticeship had an endpoint timed to Palpatine's election night. Anakin Skywalker took 10 years of deliberate cultivation before Palpatine made his move. The Attack of the Clones novelization documents this directly. Palpatine had taken a great interest in him over the last 10 years. Anakin was approximately 9 years old during the events of the Phantom Menace when he first came to Coruscant. By Attack of the Clones, he was 19. For a full decade, Palpatine maintained and deepened a relationship with a child, then an adolescent, then a young man, building toward a conversion he wouldn't attempt until the precise moment the conditions he was creating were ready. The methodology differed from every prior exhibit because the target was different. Dooku was approached as a peer, a man of equivalent intellectual standing who believed he was being invited into a partnership. Maul was conditioned as a weapon from childhood, shaped rather than persuaded. Plagueis was studied and then eliminated. Anakin was built. The psychological vulnerabilities Palpatine systematically cultivated and exploited are explicit in the canonical record. Fear of loss. Anakin had been separated from his mother at age 9 and had stood over her body on Tatooine at 19, holding her while she died, knowing he hadn't been there when it mattered. By the time of Revenge of the Sith, recurring visions of Padme dying in childbirth had become his organizing terror, the image he couldn't stop seeing, the outcome he was incapable of accepting. Resentment of institutional authority. The Council had denied him the rank of Jedi Master while simultaneously asking him to spy on the Supreme Chancellor, withholding the reasons for that request, treating the most powerful Force-sensitive alive as a surveillance asset rather than a partner. Hunger for recognition. He had been told since childhood that he was the chosen one, the prophesized agent of balance in the Force, and the institution charged with supporting his development had spent years making him feel like a liability who needed to be managed rather than a gift to be trusted. Palpatine fed all 3 simultaneously, and he'd been doing it for years before any overt move. He attended Anakin's milestones. He sought his company in Senate chambers when the Jedi Council wouldn't have approved the meetings. He listened, genuinely, attentively, in a way the Council rarely did, to Anakin's frustrations, his ambitions, his specific grievances. He validated what the Order worked to suppress. He became, over 10 years, the one powerful adult in Anakin's life who consistently treated him as an equal rather than a problem to be managed. Then, at the Coruscant Opera House, in the middle of Revenge of the Sith, he made his move. The tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise. Palpatine told Anakin about a Sith Lord who had developed such mastery over midi-chlorian manipulation that he could prevent death, including, by clear implication, the deaths of the people he loved. He framed it as legend, knowledge the Jedi would never teach, a power that existed outside the institutional boundaries of both orders. He placed the story in Anakin's hands at the precise moment Anakin was having nightly visions of Padme dying in childbirth, having spent years ensuring Anakin would tell him things he told no one else. He didn't say, "Join me and I'll save her." He said, "There is a power that can do what you need done. The Jedi would never show it to you, and I know it." He let Anakin do the math. 3 days later, in Palpatine's office, Anakin watched Mace Windu prepare to kill the Chancellor and made a choice. He cut off Windu's hand. He watched Palpatine throw Windu out of the window. He knelt. He pledged allegiance to Darth Sidious and became Darth Vader from that moment. What followed Mustafar and the suit was maintenance. But it was maintenance at a scale and specificity that reveals how completely Palpatine had thought through the post-conversion problem. Padme was dead, and Vader believed he had killed her himself. That specific belief, that the power he sought to save her was the cause of her death, was the most efficient mechanism possible for preventing grief from eventually producing clarity. A man who believed he had killed his own wife through his choices wasn't going to find the psychological space to reassess those choices. The guilt was the lock. Obi-Wan Kenobi was now an enemy. The Jedi Order had been destroyed, its scattered survivors on the run, none of them reachable without also becoming hunted. Every relationship that might have offered Vader an external reference point, every person who knew who Anakin Skywalker had been before the suit, had been eliminated, alienated, or scattered across a galaxy Vader was now actively hunting. Palpatine was the only remaining relationship in Darth Vader's life, the only person who knew his full history, the only person who understood the bargain that had been struck, the only consistent presence in an existence otherwise defined by machinery, darkness, and isolation. For 23 years, inside the suit, inside the Empire, that held. What the Anakin exhibit proves that none of the others quite establish is this: Palpatine was capable of genuine patience. The Dooku relationship was opportunistic in its origins, a willing recruit who had already left the Order. Plagueis was eliminated when the timing aligned. But Anakin required years of deliberate cultivation of a specific psychological profile, and Palpatine invested them without any guarantee of return. This wasn't a trap that sprang quickly. It was a structure built slowly enough that the person being built into it couldn't see the construction while it was happening, because the construction began when that person was 9 years old. Return of the Jedi closes that structure in the only way it could. The playbook had one gap: the suit, the guilt, the isolation, the manufactured dependency. None of it could model what happened in the throne room when Luke Skywalker refused to fight and refused to be afraid. Genuine love can't be manufactured, and therefore couldn't be predicted, defended against, or incorporated into the architecture. It operated entirely outside the system's parameters. When Vader lifted Palpatine and carried him to the shaft, the cage worked exactly as designed. The lightning passed through the suit, the life support took damage, and the rebellion became the death sentence the architecture had been built to ensure. Palpatine was right about the cage. He was wrong that the cage was enough. The first people to try undoing that ending worked at Dark Horse Comics, and their 1991 series Dark Empire at least had the intellectual honesty to construct a coherent mechanism. Palpatine had cloned himself dozens of times, a bank of bodies maintained in secret, and had refined the Sith technique of transferring consciousness from a dying host to a prepared vessel. When Vader threw him into the reactor shaft, his essence transferred. This mechanism drew on established Force philosophy regarding consciousness and the boundary between life and death, drew from Palpatine's documented obsession with cheating death, the same obsession he'd used to destroy Anakin Skywalker, and was consistent with the kind of long-horizon contingency planning the playbook establishes as his defining characteristic. A man who installed behavioral modification chips in clone soldiers years before anyone knew Order 66 existed would absolutely have prepared physical vessels for his own death. Dark Empire ran through Dark Empire 2 and into Empire's End, where Palpatine's final death in Legends came when his last clone body was destroyed, and there was no vessel left to receive him. The line ran out. It was controversial at the time. The question of whether it cheapened the original trilogy's ending was active even in 1991, but it made sense on its own terms, and it eventually resolved. The canonical answer arrived in December 2019 with The Rise of Skywalker, and the canonical answer was, somehow Palpatine returned. That line appeared in the film's opening scroll. It was the entire explanation. What the wider canonical record does establish is that Palpatine had spent years on the hidden Sith world of Exegol, operating with a cult called the Sith Eternal, constructing a fleet of Star Destroyers, each carrying planet-killing weapons. He had also been attempting to extend his physical existence through Project Necromancer, a program to create genetically strand-cast bodies capable of housing his essence. The project's most documented result was a man named Dathan, identified in canonical sources as a genetic strandcast created from Palpatine's bloodline, engineered as a vessel intended to carry his legacy forward. Dathan was born without the force sensitivity the project required. Palpatine discarded him. Dathan survived, had a daughter, and that daughter was Rey. Dathan is the only character in this entire analysis who was literally created as a tool, survived disposal by being insufficiently useful to track down, and whose existence ultimately produced the person who ended Palpatine's second life. The ultimate irony of Project Necromancer, the failed product, was the one that mattered. Palpatine's plan in Rise of Skywalker involved using Rey, a force-sensitive heir to his bloodline, either as a vessel for his essence or as a mechanism for channeling the power of the Force dyad she formed with Kylo Ren. The exact operational logic the film leaves ambiguous, which is a different kind of problem than the Legends resurrection had. Here is the structural argument, stated as precisely as possible. The Legends resurrection was coherent. It used mechanisms grounded in established philosophy, played out across multiple published works, and concluded with a genuine ending. The canonical resurrection required undoing the ending of Return of the Jedi, without explaining how it was undone. Somehow Palpatine returned isn't a story choice. It's an acknowledgement that the filmmakers needed the result without having constructed the cause. The reason this matters isn't aesthetic preference between competing canons. It's structural. Palpatine's playbook works as a coherent portrait of a methodically evil mind operating through engineered systems, because it has a specific, demonstrable flaw, and that flaw is what ends it. He engineered every dependency. He manufactured every crisis. He caged every tool. He didn't account for genuine love, because genuine love can't be manufactured, and therefore existed entirely outside his model of human behavior. That flaw was real, and it was fatal. The ending of Return of the Jedi is the only moment in the entire playbook where the playbook breaks, not through superior force, not through a smarter counter-strategy, but through a variable the entire system was constitutionally incapable of processing. Bringing him back requires the audience to believe that moment didn't break anything final, that the gap the playbook couldn't model was survivable, that 23 years of systematic dependency, built to be unbreakable, ended not in a final reckoning, but in a temporary setback. The Legends version, whatever its other qualities, committed to a genuine second arc and a genuine second ending. The canonical version asked the audience to accept the first ending as provisional, without earning that ask. From Plagueis dying in his sleep, to Dooku kneeling on the invisible hand, to Maul bleeding out on Tatooine, to Vader breathing his last through a suit designed to make that breath the cost of rebellion. Every exhibit arrives at the same conclusion. The rule of two holds that a Sith master trains an apprentice to be surpassed. That's the doctrine's entire internal logic. Each generation stronger than the last, the dark side compounding through genuine succession. Palpatine dismissed that doctrine once he became Supreme Chancellor. Canonical sources confirm he viewed himself not as a link in the Sith chain, but as its culmination, the point at which succession could stop because the goal had been achieved. Every apprentice he ever had was a controlled asset. Maul was a weapon. Dooku was a prop. Vader was the intended permanent instrument, maintained rather than cultivated toward succession. None of them were ever true successors in the rule of two sense. None were being prepared to surpass Palpatine, because Palpatine had no intention of being surpassed. The promise of succession, held out in front of each tool as long as they were useful, was itself the cage. The apprenticeship was always performance. That's what makes him too evil for the Sith. Not the body count, not the 2 Death Stars or the clone army or Alderaan. The Sith's own doctrine contains a principle of transcendence, each master genuinely investing in an apprentice capable of exceeding them. Palpatine took that doctrine and weaponized it as a leash. He corrupted the philosophy of his own order the same way he corrupted every other institution he touched, from the inside, using it against itself, until nothing remained but the mechanism of his own perpetuation. He was the final Sith because he made certain, by design, that there would never be another one. Subscribe for more stories like this.